The Edmonton Oilers dropped both games over the weekend in their return to action after the Four Nations face-off break. Is this just a season low point, or is this a genuine cause for concern? All on today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers, and I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. On today's show, going to be breaking down the games from over the weekends, but more in a macro, combining the two games into one episode to not dull over just how rough this weekend was. We're going to start with our overarching conversation about if this is just a season low point or if this is genuinely a sign of what's to come for the Oilers. We'll tackle the goaltending conversation, which is increasing in decibel. And then we'll tie a bow on today's show by going into just hunkering down and getting ready, because it's just about to be a sprint to the finish in what's been a marathon. So, at the outset, it is very difficult in real time to understand what a single game, a weekend, or a week of games means in the context of a big season. You know, in the course of a long season, there are ups and downs, highs and lows, but your goal, if you're a good team like the Oilers, you generally want to stay pretty close to that middle. You don't want the bads to be too bad. You don't want the goods to be too good, because the closer you are to an equilibrium, the more consistent you can be on a night-to-night basis, and the better your chances of winning. Now, I can't tell you definitively one way or another after this weekend if the Oilers are a sinking ship or if these are just holes in the ship. We're not going to know that for another few weeks, because the Oilers have afforded themselves quite the cushion as far as playoffs, as far as seeding in the playoffs. The Oilers have played really solid hockey for much of this year, from the end of November through the first 2 weeks of February. This was a lights out team playing really good team defense, timely situational scoring. And it's up to you, the listener or the viewer, if you're over on YouTube. Do you want to chalk this weekend up to long layoff, guys that haven't played in a few weeks? There's a little bit of rust. This was commonplace across the league. You saw a lot of teams over the weekend in one or both halves of a back-to-back look pretty sluggish, disorganized. And this is one of the real telltale signs of a team that's coming off a long layoff. You typically see this at the start of the season, where most guys only play one or two of the 9 preseason games with real intensity. They don't play the full game. And because of that, there's typically a ramping up process. And at the start of the season, I made the comparison between how football and hockey usually are at the start of the year, where in football, that typically means low scoring games because offenses don't have timing. Defenses are going to be more inclined to just get after the quarterback, try and speed up their timing even more and jack that up. In hockey at the start of the season, we see bad communication, we see positional breakdowns, and that's a lot of what we saw over the weekend, both against against Washington on Sunday and Philly on Saturday. The Oilers were all out of sorts defensively. Whether you want to talk about the defensemen or the forwards, there was just a real lack of positional awareness. There wasn't a great attention to detail. And I know where the Flyers are in the standings. The Flyers are a team of professional hockey players. If you give a team that is hungry, that is constantly poked and prodded by an authoritarian coach in John Tortorella, they are going to take you up on those offers. You know, it's not just a matter of, oh, well, the Flyers aren't that good. That is a team of professional hockey players. If you are not dialed in, a team of professionals will get it done. And when you go and look, the Oilers just all out of sorts, especially in transition. And I understand that transition play is kind of that last piece if we're talking about a complete game. Typically, if we're going to talk about the components of a good team, we start with the skill players. We talk about the literal talent, how many good forwards do they have? How many good defenses do they have? And then we go from there. But when you talk about this weekend, the lack of link up play from one pass to the next was really a struggle for the Oilers. There was a real lack of transition play, and that's where this team makes its money. This is not a grinded out style of team. They are going to need to win puck battles in their own zone. They need to break the puck out cleanly, and then they need to attack the offensive zone with speed. But because they were so sloppy in their own ends, because they struggled passing guys off, because they watched pucks a lot in the defensive zone, it was really hard for them to break out, to go the other way. And we know this is the way to stop a team like Edmonton, that it lives in transition. If you get the puck in deep and you make them work, especially below the hash marks, you can start to really wear down and exploit their team's weaknesses. Evan Bouchard is this team's best defenseman, but Bouchard's greatness as a defenseman is largely tied to his ability to influence play in a way that reduces the amount of overall defense he needs to play. If he gets stuck in his own zone over and over and over again, him and Ekholm had a really rough weekend. McDavid, especially on the defensive end, he had a rough weekend as well. The Oilers lost his minutes in scoring chances over the weekend. So it's something to be considered. It's something to take stock of, and trying to distill whether or not this is, the low watermark in what's a long season, or if this is an emerging trend. That's what we're going to figure out over the next handful of weeks. And there's no way to know in the moment, because these very well could just be two isolated games after a long layoff. A couple guys coming back from Four Nations, Arvidsson and Ekholm. Ekholm had been battling an illness before the Four Nations break, went on that break. A lot of guys on multiple teams in the tournament. All four teams had guys miss games in this tournament because of a flu that was going around. So you are inclined to give certain players the benefit of the doubt. I think Ekholm, McDavid, Bush, Draisaitl, there are certain guys you're inclined to give the benefit of the doubt to and say, that might have just been a bad few games. They got to get their timing right. That they can be afforded some grace based on what they are talent-wise, what their track record says they are. And then there are some guys who we're going to pivot to in our next segment that they might just be what they are. And when you talk about goaltending, the big conversation always comes down to, do you trust this guy to win in a big spot? And it's not because of them. There are some goalies who just do enough that they're complimentary, and that's all their team needs of them. But there does need to be a certain baseline level of competency to work from. It's the same exact metaphor as when we're talking about a team, high watermark, low watermarks, trying to stay as close to that middle as you can. Even if you think Stuart Skinner has more talent than he's displayed, you think he's better than his stats, he still needs to get closer to an equilibrium to feel like he has a high enough watermark to be the backstop to a Stanley Cup contender. But as that conversation increases in chatter and volume, we're going to take our first break. We come back, we're going to talk about the Oilers goaltending situation and why, even though we might all agree they need an upgrade, it's going to be really tough to do. Coming up next on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help you keep feeling fuller longer. Personally, I love the no-shell variety. They're the perfect grab-and-go snack for busy days when I'm at my desk trying to squeeze in a little bit of extra protein into my macros for the day. Or if you're old school and you love cracking open a shell for that satisfying crunch, the in-shell options are a classic favorite. Get snacking and get cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out here on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers as we mentally prepare for the sprint to the trade deadline and ultimately the postseason. And coming into the season, if you had told me where the Oilers were in the standings, if you told me what the record was, what the counting stats looked like, I would have probably nodded and said, that sounds about right. And then my next question would have been, well, how's the goaltending? And I think it's really important that we contextualize goaltending when we analyze it with respect to the team and how it plays in front of the goalie. Now, I am not trying to absolve Stuart Skinner or Calvin Pickard, for that matter, for their performances this past weekend. I understand that a lot of hockey fans will simply look at it as they need a save. They need to make a save from time to time, regardless of the challenge, the difficulty of the save. There is an expectation that every now and then your goalie is going to be able to pick you up, make a stop there. You probably wouldn't expect them to, and that's going to swing a little bit of momentum. But when the Oilers play as porously as they did over the weekend on the back end, it makes these guys' lives a lot more challenging. And we go back to one of our I got to think of a word for these. I won't call them a Nickism because that just sounds a little too pretentious, but a Locked On Oilers-ism, if you will. Stuart Skinner cannot be the difference between the Oilers winning and losing hockey games. So they're going to lose a lot of hockey games. He's not that caliber of guy. He's not a Shesterkin. He's not a Vasilevsky. He's not a Sorokin. He is not that tier of goalie. He is firmly in that middle class tier with a considerable amount of the league. And look, there is not enough goaltending talent, period. You know, you look around the state of the league, there are maybe 10 guys you feel reasonably confident in a league of 32 teams. I mean, you look at the state of the goaltending situations at the Four Nations face-off, where Finland was down to a second, third string goalie. And look, I think Kevin Lainenen's pretty good, but that's the best Finland has to offer in a best-on-best tournament. For all due respect, Jordan Binnington had a good tournament, especially he had a good final against the United States. Jordan Binnington's not a top 10 goalie in the NHL. Montembaugh is not a top 10 goalie in the NHL. You look at Sweden, I know a couple of their goalies, Markstrom's been dinged up. I know they had Olmark play, but he's a little bit dinged up as well. They were down to a third string goalie in Sam Ersson as well. I get it. But we do have to put some context around this because I think both things can be true at the same time. I think the Oilers need to play better defensively if they want to complain about the goaltending. Because if you look around the NHL, you will see that if a team sleepwalks, if a team stinks up the joint, it does not matter if you have an Igor Shesterkin in net, as I will point you to the score of the Rangers-Sabres game from Saturday afternoon. But I can also say, and authoritatively say, with Stuart Skinner in net, it feels like the Oilers as a Stanley Cup winning team is the highest range of outcome. You know, it's the top 0.1 percentile of outcomes if you were to lay out all the possible permutations for the rest of the season, the playoffs, etc. It feels like the Oilers' ceiling with Stuart Skinner in net is probably a little bit below that. And I have made the argument for most of my duration as host of Locked On Oilers, and even before that, that I don't think you need a truly elite goalie. I don't think you need that Shesterkin, Bobrovsky, Vasilevsky. I don't think you need that tier of guy. You can point to guys like Binnington and Darcy Kemper and Aiden Hill. You know, you point to that tier of guy where top 12, 13 goalie, solid regular season, can occasionally come up with a big stop, has some big game pedigree. If you're someone like Binnington, who's won 2 winner-take-all big games, the gold medal in the Four Nations and then a Game 7 against the Bruins in 2019, you can point to that and say, okay, his regular season numbers aren't incredible, but on occasion, he has risen to the occasion, and that is worth something. Whereas you look at Stuart Skinner, like a lot of Oiler fans over the last day and a half, 2 days have, and they kind of squint and they say, his save percentage is kind of low. His goals against average is kind of high. I don't have a lot of confidence in this guy. And I don't have confidence in Calvin Pickard if he needed to start multiple games in a row. I think the Oilers are at the upper bound of what they are capable of doing with this roster construction, the way they've allocated money. I think they are maybe the single most important team in terms of the cap going up over the next 2 years, where we're going to get some market increase. We're going to get some cap increases in line with revenue increases that are long overdue, and it's going to afford the Oilers more money to spend around their roster. But they have really, really scraped together certain parts of their lineup when you talk about some of the defensemen they've brought in, what they're paying them, and then the goalie tandem. And I like Stuart Skinner, the person. This is not a condemnation of Stuart Skinner or Calvin Pickard for that matter. I just fundamentally think the group needs a little bit more from that position, and nothing Stuart Skinner or Calvin Pickard has shown you for an extended period of time lead you to believe they can get there. And this is a really difficult conversation for organizations to have about certain positions. We talk about it. It's probably the most in any sport in terms of quarterback in football, where if you have a guy who isn't at that requisite baseline, as good as those 49er teams, they still had Jimmy Garoppolo as the quarterback. We might be seeing that as far as the Lions with Jared Goff as the quarterback. Sean McVay went to the Super Bowl with Jared Goff, and he only scored 3 points in that Super Bowl. As good as that Lions roster is, top to bottom, at a certain point, you need your most important player, the quarterback, the guy who touches the ball every offensive play, to be able to elevate the guys around him. And it's a similar conversation as far as goaltending. And I understand the Oilers' apprehension to move on from Skinner because they've been on the goalie carousel for so long. They feel that if they have a homegrown guy who's cheap and has upside, and if they're patient with him, that he might eventually get to that peak. He might be able to maximize his potential. I understand that patience, but at the same time, and I think this is where most Oiler fans are at now, you can wait for a player to reach their peak, but that's one guy. You can't be wasting years of Leon Connor and Evan Bouchard's primes on a goalie trying to get to their peak. And again, that's not an indictment of Stuart Skinner. He is what he is as a player. There might be more there, but can the Oilers, for that matter, afford to wait to see if he gets there? And I think that's kind of, I won't say the realization, because that feels a bit more finalized and determinate. And I don't think the book is closed on what Stuart Skinner is entirely, just because he's very young in his goaltending career as an NHL player. And he might be able to do something more in another environment with less responsibility, but there's no way of knowing that. And the Oilers are not in a position where they can afford to wait. And it's almost going to be impossible to upgrade that position going into the trade deadline, because there are not enough goalies on the market to go around to make prices reasonable. So that's number one. It's going to cost you a lot more than you would want to pay. And then number two, it's really hard to successfully integrate a goalie in season to a new team, because so much of goaltending is environmental and what a guy's doing well in Anaheim. If you're talking about John Gibson, or if you're talking about Karel Vejmelka of the Utah Hockey Club, whatever's making them successful there might not be able to be successful in Edmonton. So we're going to take one more break on today's show. We'll tie a bow on this episode, setting the table for the sprint to the trade deadline coming up right after this. So be sure to stick around. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout games. So even if you missed the opening tip or want to bet on a big fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same game parlay. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whenever I'm together with my friends and we have a game on, it is so much fun to try and back a team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch three. I feel like I never really missed the game. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Monday edition of Locked On Oilers as we are recapping the debris of the weekend. And I don't want to get hysterical because it's very easy in a small sample to take the worst parts of the team and feel like they're fatal flaws. And after this weekend, I wouldn't blame you if you felt like the Oilers' fatal flaw was exposed, that if you put heat on their defense, you force their defenders to make plays in zone, you start to put pressure on their goaltending. And then once you get pressure on their goaltending, it starts to snowball from there. And it gets to 3 and 4 and 5. And it becomes entirely untenable. And as talented, the Oilers never felt like they were going to be able to mount comebacks in either of these games. And that's fundamentally different than what we saw prior to the the Four Nations face-off break, that they were getting behind early in games. You point to the Chicago game, the Pittsburgh game, the Minnesota game, and they mounted furious comebacks in some of them, and then in other ones they didn't. And that is not a sustainable way to play consistently. It's just too taxing on your defenders to be in a consistently disadvantageous position for long stretches of time. You need to play with leads. You need to play in tie games because hockey is such a score-dependent environment. When a team has a lead versus when they are trailing versus when it's tied, they are fundamentally different. It's almost like playing different teams. And the Oilers got slumped, especially, and look, I know Washington has the best record in the NHL. They have very savvily put together a well-rounded four-line team. The Jacob Chikrin and Matt Roy additions have done wonders. Their goaltending tandem of Logan Thompson and Charlie Lindgren they've put together off the scrap heap has been nothing short of remarkable, but they got going downhill. They forced the Oilers to start cheating for offense, and that's when you break a team down. When forwards start flying the zone early, when they start trying to hit a pass that's 20 feet, 25 feet, as opposed to 10 to 15, that's where you can start to jump those long passes. You put guys in conflict, and you force them to play defense. And Washington is a good hockey team. Make no mistake about it. There's no shame in losing to a good hockey team. There is shame in getting smoked. There is a difference. And again, good teams get blown out. It happens. It's part of hockey. Sometimes it is fundamentally not your day. The environmental factors, 2 games back to back on the road, Eastern time zone, coming off a long layoff. There's a lot environmentally working against the Oilers to be like, well, I can kind of understand why they had a hard time over the last few days. It's reasonable. It makes sense. But there is a certain level of professional obligation there on the part of the guys on that team to find answers to their problems. That includes the coaching staff. And I'm not going to get on Chris Knobloch for 2 bad games. I think I am capable of separating the 2 games within the context of the environment, the road games, back-to-back, matinee times, on the road, coming off a long layoff. Your best player played grueling hockey for a week and a half, and it's not an excuse. We are being logical, rational people. There are a lot of factors that go into an evaluation, and you want to be fair because it's easy. It is very easy to be emotional, and let those feelings carry your opinion. And it's really important that if you want to be as knowledgeable or as based as you can be in these arguments, that you find answers based in evidence. And that's why I can't definitively tell you if this is, the low watermark for the season, or if this is fundamentally a beginning of the dam breaking. This might just be an aberration. This might just be, two bad games against okay to very good teams on the opposite coast. You're coming off a long break. All your guys are a little bit rusty. Philly didn't look rusty. Washington didn't look rusty. There are exceptions. You have to be accountable. And the one last point I want to make before I get everyone out of here to their Monday, when you look at it through that lens of it's been a long season already just to get to this point. And from the very start of the season, the Oilers knew we're a playoff team. We have Stanley Cup aspirations. So in the back of your mind, you got to keep that at bay, that sense of entitlement, that sense of confidence that no matter what we do, we're probably going to make the playoffs. That's number one. Then you got to maintain that focus day after day after day after day. Then you get 2 weeks off in the middle of the season. Guys go abroad. Guys check out ever so slightly. Yeah, they might be skating. They're working out. It's not the same thing as playing in games. Timing is hard to simulate. When you have a forechecker bearing down on you and you got to get that puck from point A to point B, it's really hard to simulate that environment, because in a practice, someone's not coming to blow you up the same way they would in a real game. And you know that in the back of your mind. So you're not going to hold on to that puck as long, because well, he's not going to blow me up. This is practice. And you make the pass and you go on to the next drill, or the next skater comes on for the next drill. And then in a game, if you hold on to that puck just half a beat longer and you don't get it off as cleanly and you're stuck in your own zone and the other team starts to cycle you, you take a penalty, you concede a good scoring chance, you concede a goal against, it starts to snowball. And this weekend was about as big a snowball as you're going to see from what's a good team. I don't think the last 2 days erase what the Oilers are, but I do think it begs the question of how much can this team still improve? And is that going to be enough? It's not just in terms of who you add at the deadline. It's have the guys who have been here all year find their games collectively and start to really elevate, to push the upper boundary. To quote the great Michael Jordan, is the ceiling the roof? Can we make the ceiling the roof? Can we get to that peak? Because that journey starts now. It's not just in the playoffs. It's not just after the trade deadline. You got to be playing pretty good hockey by the time the playoffs start. So that way, when you drop the puck round one, game one, your guys are focused, locked in, and you can get out of there in 5 or 6 games to put yourself in an advantageous position for the second round, and so on and so forth. There's a strong correlation between putting teams away early in series and moving on and moving deeper into the postseason, because playoff games are so taxing. And you can't do that if you're still trying to iron out the kinks and find the optimal layout of your roster, the optimal deployment of your roster when that first round starts. But that will do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, or if you're listening over on YouTube, hit that subscribe button and hit that alarm bell to get a notification whenever new episodes go out. And thank you for making Locked On Oilers your first listen today. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NHL podcast, bringing you the daily league-wide stories that matter with the local coverage you love from Locked On and all of its experts. Find Locked On NHL on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. I will talk to you guys tomorrow. Until then, let's go Oilers.